Tokyo, Japan, March 23, 1976, 10:30 a.m. In a mansion in Setagaya, 65-year-old Yoshio Kodama sat in his study, reading the morning newspapers. The headlines praised him, called him a patriot, a business leader, a bridge between government and industry. They didn't mention that he controlled Japan's largest Yakuza organizations. They didn't mention the bribes, the blackmail, the murders. They didn't mention that he'd made millions selling American military contracts to Japanese companies, taking cuts from both sides. Kodama was untouchable, protected by politicians he'd helped elect, protected by police he'd helped appoint, protected by Yakuza who owed him their territory. 2,000 feet above him, Mitsuyasu Maeno sat in the cockpit of a Piper PA-28 Cherokee, hands steady on the controls, mind focused on a single thought. Today, the untouchable man would be touched. Maeno wasn't a terrorist. He wasn't insane. He was a 29-year-old actor who'd watched Kodama corrupt everything Japan claimed to stand for. He'd written his suicide note. He'd said goodbye to his family. He'd filled the plane with just enough fuel to reach Setagaya. At 10:31 a.m., Kodama turned a page in his newspaper. At 10:32 a.m., Maeno pushed the control stick forward. At 10:33 a.m., Japan would witness something it hadn't seen since World War II, a kamikaze attack, not against an enemy nation, against its own shadow government. But to understand why a young actor would sacrifice his life to kill a man the newspapers called a hero, we need to go back 30 years, to World War II, when Yoshio Kodama first learned that power comes not from position, but from knowing everyone's secrets. World War II, the making of Yoshio Kodama. Yoshio Kodama was born in 1911 in Nihonmatsu, a small city in northern Japan. His early life was unremarkable. Middle-class family, standard education, no particular wealth or privilege. But young Kodama had ambition. And in 1930s Japan, ambition meant aligning yourself with the military government that was transforming Japan into an imperial power. In his 20s, Kodama joined ultranationalist organizations, groups that believed Japan's destiny was to dominate Asia, to build an empire, to restore the emperor to absolute power. He became a fixer, a negotiator, someone who could connect military officers with businessmen, politicians with criminal organizations. These skills would define his entire life. During World War II, Kodama was sent to China as an agent for the Imperial Japanese Navy. His official role was resource procurement, a bureaucratic term that meant steal everything valuable and send it back to Japan. Kodama excelled. He organized networks of smugglers, black marketeers, and criminals across occupied China. He looted gold, platinum, industrial diamonds, strategic materials. He made connections with Chinese criminal syndicates, Korean gangsters, Japanese Yakuza operating in occupied territories. And most importantly, he kept detailed records. Records of who took bribes, who collaborated, who profited from the war. These records would become his insurance policy, his leverage, his path to power in post-war Japan. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Kodama returned to Tokyo with a fortune in looted materials. Estimates ranged from $20 million to $175 million, an astronomical sum at the time. He also returned with those records: names, dates, transactions, crimes. He knew which politicians had collaborated with the military government, which businessmen had profited from war contracts, which military officers had committed war crimes. And he understood something crucial. In post-war Japan, everyone would want to forget, to move on, to rebuild. And anyone who threatened to expose the past would be very, very powerful. The American occupation, making a deal with power. When American forces occupied Japan in 1945, they faced a dilemma. Japan needed to be rebuilt, democratized, transformed from a militaristic empire into a peaceful democracy. But they couldn't do it alone. They needed Japanese partners, people who understood Japanese society, who had connections, who could make things happen. The Americans, particularly U.S. intelligence agencies, made a calculated decision. They would work with former Japanese war criminals if those criminals could help contain communism and maintain stability. Yoshio Kodama was perfect. He had connections across Japanese society, politicians, businessmen, yakuza, ultranationalists. He had money. That fortune looted from China. He was fiercely anti-communist, which aligned with American Cold War priorities. And he was willing to work with anyone. In 1948, Kodama was arrested as a suspected war criminal. He spent 3 years in Sugamo prison, awaiting trial, but he was never prosecuted. Instead, in 1951, he was released. No trial, no charges, no explanation. The truth, which wouldn't be declassified until decades later, Kodama had made a deal with American intelligence. He would use his connections to help the Americans build a conservative, pro-Western government in Japan. In return, he'd be protected, his war crimes forgotten, his fortune legitimized. And so began Kodama's second career, as Japan's most powerful kuramaku, Black Curtain, the man behind the scenes who controlled politicians, yakuza, and businessmen. The kuramaku, the shadow shogun of Japan. Throughout the 1950s, 1960s, and early 1970s, Yoshio Kodama operated as Japan's ultimate fixer. He didn't hold official positions. He wasn't elected to anything. He worked from his mansion in Setagaya, receiving visitors, making phone calls, arranging deals. His power came from 3 sources. First, money. Kodama was extraordinarily wealthy. He'd invested his wartime fortune in real estate, construction companies, and eventually, connections to American defense contractors. When American companies wanted to sell military equipment to Japan, aircraft, missiles, weapons systems, they went through Kodama. He'd take a cut from the Americans for arranging the deal, then take a cut from the Japanese companies who got the contracts, then take a cut from the politicians who approved the contracts. He made millions on every deal. Second, information. Kodama still had those wartime records. He knew everyone's secrets. Which politician had collaborated with war criminals? Which businessman had profited from slave labor? Which media executive had written propaganda? If you crossed Kodama, your secrets might become public. Third, yakuza connections. Kodama had close relationships with every major yakuza organization in Japan: the Yamaguchi-gumi, the Inagawa-kai, the Sumiyoshi-kai. He mediated disputes between these groups, preventing gang wars that might destabilize Japanese society. In return, the yakuza provided muscle when Kodama needed it, breaking strikes, intimidating journalists, eliminating problems. By the mid-1970s, Kodama had become something unprecedented in modern Japan, a private citizen with more practical power than most government ministers. He'd helped elect prime ministers. He'd arranged billion-dollar defense contracts. He'd prevented and started gang wars. He was untouchable, except he'd made one mistake. He'd gotten too visible, too arrogant, too comfortable, and that made him a target. The Lockheed scandal, when corruption went too far. In 1972, All Nippon Airways, one of Japan's largest airlines, was deciding which wide-body aircraft to purchase for its fleet. The 2 main competitors were Boeing's 747 and Lockheed's L-1011 TriStar. This was a multi-billion-yen contract. Whichever company won would dominate Japanese aviation for decades. Lockheed hired Yoshio Kodama as their agent in Japan. His job, convince ANA to choose the TriStar. His payment, millions of dollars in secret commissions. Kodama went to work. He bribed Japanese politicians. He bribed ANA executives. He bribed government officials who regulated aviation. The bribes were systematic, well-documented, and enormous, eventually totaling over $12 million, equivalent to over $80 million today. In 1972, ANA chose the Lockheed TriStar. Lockheed executives celebrated. Kodama collected his commission. Everyone thought it was over. But in February 1976, during U.S. Senate hearings investigating Lockheed's international bribery, everything came out. American senators revealed the payments to Kodama. Japanese newspapers, which had always treated Kodama carefully because of his power, now had cover to report on him. The scandal exploded. Japanese Prime Minister Kakue Tanaka, who'd received bribes through Kodama, was forced to resign. Dozens of politicians were implicated. The Japanese public was outraged. For decades, ordinary Japanese citizens had suspected that their government was corrupt, that politicians were controlled by shadowy fixers, that democracy was a facade. Now they had proof, and the man at the center of it all, the man who'd taken millions to corrupt Japanese democracy, was Yoshio Kodama. One person watching the scandal unfold was Mitsuyasu Maeno, and Maeno decided that someone needed to do something. Mitsuyasu Maeno, the unlikely kamikaze. Mitsuyasu Maeno was born in 1947, 2 years after World War II ended. He grew up in post-war Japan, in a society trying to rebuild itself, trying to create a new identity separate from the militaristic past. Maeno was artistic, idealistic, troubled. He struggled to find his place. He worked as an actor in pornographic films, not mainstream cinema, but the underground adult film industry that existed in Tokyo's shadows. It wasn't a prestigious career, but it paid. Maeno was also intensely political. He believed in traditional Japanese values: honor, loyalty, sacrifice for the greater good. But he believed the current Japanese system had betrayed those values, that politicians were corrupt, that Yakuza controlled society, that men like Yoshio Kodama had turned Japan into a country where money and power trumped honor and justice. When the Lockheed scandal broke in February 1976, Maeno was transfixed. He read every article, watched every news report. He saw Kodama's name everywhere: the fixer, the Kuramaku, the man who'd taken millions to corrupt Japanese democracy. And he became convinced that the Japanese legal system would never hold Kodama accountable. Kodama was too powerful, too connected, too protected. Prosecutors might investigate, but they'd never prosecute. And even if they prosecuted, Kodama would never see the inside of a prison cell. Someone needed to deliver justice. And Maeno decided that someone would be him. But not through conventional means. Maeno decided to become a kamikaze pilot. The plan: preparation for death. Maeno spent weeks planning. First, he needed an aircraft. He enrolled in flight lessons at a small aviation school outside Tokyo, claiming he wanted to learn, to fly for recreation. He was a diligent student, serious, focused. His instructors thought he was just another hobbyist. Within a month, Maeno had earned his pilot's license. Next, he needed to rent a plane. In 1976, aviation security was minimal. If you had a pilot's license and money for rental fees, you could rent a small aircraft, no questions asked. On March 22, 1976, Maeno rented a Piper PA-28 Cherokee from the flight school. He told them he wanted to practice solo flying. They handed him the keys. That evening, Maeno wrote his suicide note. It was addressed to his family, but also to the Japanese public. In it, he explained his reasoning. Yoshio Kodama has betrayed Japan. He has sold our democracy to foreign corporations. He has corrupted our politicians. He has brought shame to our nation. The legal system will not punish him because he controls the legal system. Therefore, I will deliver the justice that the law cannot. I do this not as an act of terrorism, but as an act of patriotism. Japan must be purified, and sometimes Purification requires sacrifice. I do not expect to be remembered as a hero. I expect to be condemned, called a criminal, a madman. But I know the truth. I am doing what is necessary. I am giving my life so that Japan might have honor again." He left the note in his apartment, knowing police would find it after his death. On the morning of March 23, 1976, Maeno drove to the flight school, climbed into the Piper Cherokee, and took off. The flight. The last 30 minutes. Maeno took off at 10:00 a.m. He flew northwest toward Tokyo, keeping low enough to avoid attention, but high enough to navigate by landmarks. He had a map. He had Kodama's address. He had a plan. At 10:20 a.m., he circled over Setagaya, locating Kodama's mansion. It was large, distinctive, a traditional Japanese estate surrounded by walls, with a tile roof and carefully maintained gardens. Security was present but minimal. A few guards at the gate. No, anti-aircraft defenses, obviously. Nobody expected an aerial attack in peacetime Tokyo. Maeno circled twice more, getting his bearings, calculating his approach angle. He wanted to hit the main building where Kodama lived and worked. He wanted to ensure Kodama would be there. It was mid-morning, Kodama's typical working hours. At 10:30 a.m., Maeno climbed to 2,000 feet. He said a prayer, not to any specific deity, but to Japan itself, to the concept of honor he believed he was defending. Then he pushed the control stick forward. The Piper Cherokee began its dive. The crash. 10:33 a.m., Yoshio Kodama was in his study, reading newspapers, sipping green tea that a servant had brought him 15 minutes earlier when he heard the sound. A loud, growing roar. An aircraft engine. Close. Too close. Wrong. Aircraft didn't fly this low over residential Tokyo. This was wrong. Instinctively, something ancient in his brain, some memory from World War II, from hearing American bombers, overhead, triggered alarm. He looked up from his newspaper. Through the window, he saw it. A small plane, single engine, diving directly toward his house. Not circling, not passing overhead. Diving, coming straight at him. The nose pointed down at a 45-degree angle, the propeller spinning. The wings tilted slightly as the pilot made final corrections to his approach. Kodama had perhaps 3 seconds to process what was happening. 3 seconds to understand that someone was trying to kill him. 3 seconds to recognize that the impossible was happening. Japan was witnessing a kamikaze attack in 1976. He tried to stand, to move, to escape. But there wasn't time. Then the plane hit. The Piper Cherokee struck the second floor of Kodama's mansion at approximately 150 miles per hour, hitting the structure just above and behind where Kodama sat in his first-floor study. The impact was catastrophic. The aircraft disintegrated on contact. The wings sheared off instantly, spinning, away like discarded paper, one crashing into the garden, the other falling onto the street outside. The fuselage, carrying the engine, and what remained of the cockpit, where Maeno's body sat strapped in, crumpled like aluminum foil as it punched through the mansion's tile roof, through wooden beams, through the floor structure, through everything. The engine, weighing nearly 400 pounds and moving at 150 miles per hour, became a massive projectile. It tore through the building structure like a cannonball, smashing through interior walls, destroying everything in its path, finally coming to rest in what had been a second-floor bedroom. The fuel tanks, holding approximately 30 gallons of aviation gasoline, ruptured on impact. Fuel sprayed in every direction, across wooden beams, across tatami mats, across paper screens and furniture, and everything combustible in a traditional Japanese house. Then came ignition. Aviation fuel, atomized into a fine mist by the violence of the crash, found an ignition source immediately. Perhaps electrical sparks from severed wiring, perhaps friction from metal scraping metal, perhaps the superheated engine itself. It didn't matter. The result was instantaneous, a massive fireball that engulfed the entire second floor in flames. Wooden beams, dry from decades of existence, caught fire immediately. Tatami mats, made of rice straw, burned like kindling. Paper screens, shoji, vaporized. The fire spread with terrifying speed, consuming the second floor in less than 60 seconds. Mitsuyasu Maeno died on impact. The deceleration from 150 miles per hour to zero in less than 1 second, what physicists call rapid deceleration trauma, killed him instantly. Every bone in his body shattered, his internal organs ruptured. His body was thrown forward against the instrument panel with such force that the metal crushed inward. Then came the fire, which burned his body beyond recognition. Later, investigators would need dental records to confirm his identity. Yoshio Kodama, incredibly, survived. He'd been sitting in his first-floor study when the plane hit the second floor above and slightly behind him. The ceiling above his head partially collapsed. Wooden beams and plaster and debris rained down, covering his desk, knocking over furniture. Dust and smoke filled the air instantly. Kodama felt the concussion wave from the explosion, a pressure blast that knocked him backward in his chair. He heard the roar of flames above him, smelled burning fuel, realized, with the clarity that comes in life-threatening moments, that he was about to die in a fire. His bodyguards, stationed in an adjacent room, reacted within seconds. 2 men burst through the study door, grabbed Kodama, who was disoriented, bleeding from cuts caused by falling debris, and physically dragged him toward the nearest exit. They could hear the fire above them, could feel the heat intensifying, could see smoke beginning to pour down the stairwell. They had perhaps 30 seconds before the first floor would be engulfed. They made it. Barely. The bodyguards pulled Kodama through a side door that led to the garden, getting him outside just as flames began spreading to the first floor. Once outside, they ran, away from the house, across the garden, toward the perimeter wall, putting distance between themselves and the burning building in case there were secondary explosions. Kodama collapsed on the grass, coughing, bleeding, but alive. By 10:45 a.m., fire trucks arrived. By 11 a.m., the fire was contained. By noon, news crews surrounded the mansion, and by evening, the entire world knew. Japan had just experienced its first kamikaze attack since World War II. The aftermath, a nation confronts its past. The Japanese public reaction was complex, conflicted, revealing. On one hand, everyone condemned the violence. Maeno had attempted murder. He'd endangered innocent people, servants in the mansion, neighbors, people on the ground if the plane had crashed elsewhere. He'd broken every law. But on the other hand, many Japanese citizens quietly admired him. Not his methods, but his motivation. Maeno had tried to do what the legal system wouldn't: hold Yoshio Kodama accountable. Newspapers published Maeno's suicide note in full. The public read his words and understood his anger. A poll conducted a week after the attack found that while 78% of Japanese citizens disapproved of Maeno's violence, 54% agreed with his assessment that the Japanese legal system was too corrupt to prosecute powerful figures like Kodama. Kodama himself never fully recovered. The shock, the injuries, the public exposure, it broke him. He withdrew from public life entirely. No more visitors, no more deals, no more power. In July 1976, 4 months after the attack, Kodama was formally indicted in the Lockheed scandal. He was charged with bribery, tax evasion, and violations of foreign exchange laws. But he was never tried. He claimed ill health, refused to appear in court, and his lawyers delayed proceedings for years. Yoshio Kodama died in 1984 at age 73, having never stood trial. His death sparked another debate in Japan. Had justice been served? Or had one of Japan's most corrupt figures escaped accountability even after being exposed, indicted, and nearly killed? The legacy. Honor versus corruption. Mitsuyasu Maeno's kamikaze attack didn't kill Yoshio Kodama. It didn't reform Japanese politics. It didn't end corruption. But it did something else. It forced Japan to confront a question the country had been avoiding since 1945. What kind of nation had Japan become? After World War II, Japan had claimed to transform itself, to abandon militarism, embrace democracy, become a peaceful, modern nation. But the Lockheed scandal and Maeno's attack revealed that beneath the surface, the old system still operated. The same powerful figures, the same corruption, the same unwillingness to hold elites accountable. Maeno's attack was shocking because it used World War II symbolism, the kamikaze, the ultimate expression of Japanese militaristic sacrifice, to attack post-war corruption. It suggested that perhaps the old Japan and the new Japan weren't so different. That perhaps the country had changed its appearance, but not its character. In the years following the attack, Japan did implement some reforms: stricter campaign finance laws, more aggressive prosecution of corruption, greater media scrutiny of politicians. But many Japanese citizens remained cynical. They'd seen too much, known too much, understood that men like Yoshio Kodama weren't exceptions. They were symptoms of a system that allowed power to operate without accountability. Today, if you visit Setagaya, Kodama's mansion is gone. It was torn down years ago, replaced by modern apartments. There's no memorial to Mitsuyasu Maeno. He's remembered, if at all, as a troubled man who committed an act of violence. But in certain circles in Japan, among people who remember the 1970s, who lived through the Lockheed scandal, who watched the corruption and felt powerless, Maeno is remembered differently. Not as a hero, exactly, but as someone who tried, who sacrificed himself to make a statement, who believed that honor mattered more than life. And in a country that had spent 30 years trying to forget its past relationship with honor and sacrifice, that memory remains complicated, troubling, and strangely powerful. If you found this story compelling, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from organized crime history. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Thank you for watching.